Montana Territory, Bitterroot Valley, November 1883. Nobody paid much attention to Caleb Morrow at first. He was quiet the way mountains are quiet. Not absence of thought, but presence of something too heavy to explain in words. He had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley 2 winters before, carrying a broadaxe, a surveying rope, and a hand-drawn diagram that, to anyone who glanced at it, looked like a mistake. 8 sides, 8 walls meeting at angles that no carpenter in the valley had ever attempted on a log structure. Not a barn, not a trading post. A home. His home. The most respected builder in the region. A stonemason and framing carpenter by the name of Reuben Aldrich, who had raised more than 40 square-walled cabins across western Montana, took one look at Caleb's diagram and said nothing for a long moment. Then he handed it back and said, "Son, you'll freeze inside that thing before Christmas. Or burn. Either way, I won't be called to fix it." That was October. By December, the valley would give its verdict. But here is what nobody understood that morning. Not Aldrich, not the loggers who laughed at the shape being staked out in the frozen ground, not even the few who wished Caleb well. The Octagon wasn't a preference. It wasn't stubbornness or eccentricity. It was an answer to a problem that square cabins have been failing to solve for decades. A heat problem, a survival problem. And Caleb Morrow had done the math. Not on paper, but in frozen fingers and sleepless nights, and 2 brutal Montana winters spent watching other men's firewood disappear. What did this quiet homesteader understand about heat and geometry that trained builders had completely missed? Stay with us, because the number that came out of that winter, 21 degrees Fahrenheit, changed the way people in this valley built for a generation. If you've never heard of octagonal frontier cabins, you're not alone. Most historians haven't either. Subscribe right now, because every week we bring you a technique that real people built, tested, and survived with. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and how cold does it get where you live? The best answers get featured next week. To understand why Caleb Morrow went octagonal, you have to understand what a standard square log cabin actually felt like in a Montana winter. From the outside, those cabins looked solid. Heavy timbered walls, chinked with clay and moss, squared corners notched with care. But corners, the very feature that gave square cabins their familiar, trustworthy shape, were also their greatest liability. Heat doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in gradients, radiating outward from its source and escaping toward the coldest surface available. In a square room, the 4 corners act like cold funnels. Air stagnates there. Frost forms there first. Ice creeps inward from those angles while the center of the room, nearest the fire, stays comparatively warm. The result was a cabin that could have a blazing hearth at its center and still have frozen water pails in the corners by morning. Caleb had lived this. His first winter in the Bitterroot, renting a corner berth in a shared square cabin near the Stevie trading post, he had watched 3 grown men burn through nearly 7 cords of wood between November and March, and still wake to find their breath crystallized on the wall above their heads. 7 cords. That was approximately 14,000 pounds of split timber, hauled, stacked, and fed into a fireplace that, by any honest measure, returned less than a third of its heat into the room. The rest went up the chimney or radiated straight through the walls. The second problem was the fireplace itself. In a square cabin, the conventional placement was against one wall, usually the north or east face, to block prevailing winds from pushing smoke back down the flue. This meant the fire heated one side of the room intensely while the opposite wall remained cold. Oral accounts from that period describe the experience as sitting with your front scorching and your back freezing. Men rotated around the hearth like meat on a spit, never fully warm. Caleb's insight, which he had been turning over for 2 full winters, was geometric. If you increase the number of walls, you decrease the angle at each corner. A square corner is 90 degrees, a sharp, cold trap. An octagonal corner is 135 degrees, far more open, far less prone to cold air pooling. More critically, an 8-sided room allowed a central fireplace or stove placement with roughly equal distance from the heat source to every wall. No scorching front, no frozen back. even radiation in all directions. And if you built the walls thick enough, Caleb was planning on 10 to 12 inches of solid fir. The thermal mass of the structure itself would store heat and release it slowly, long after the fire had burned down. He had talked about this with no one. Not because he was secretive, but because he had tried once, sketching the idea on a feed sack for a fellow boarder, and the man had laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. So Caleb bought his land, felled his timber, and started staking out 8 sides in the frozen ground. Alone. An octagonal log cabin is not simply a square cabin with extra corners. It is a fundamentally different engineering problem, and Caleb Morrow had worked through most of it during 2 years of cold weather observation and quiet calculation. The first challenge was the logs themselves. In a standard square cabin, logs are stacked horizontally and notched at 4 corners, each log spanning the full width of one wall. In an octagon, you have 8 wall sections, and each log must be cut and notched to meet its neighbor at a 135-degree angle instead of 90. This requires a bevel cut at both ends of every wall log. Not just a notch, but a precise angular face that would seat flush against the adjacent wall section. Caleb used a hand-drawn bevel gauge, calibrated by bisecting a right angle with a compass and straight edge, a technique borrowed, local accounts suggest, from a German immigrant millwright he had worked alongside the previous summer. The second challenge was the roof. Octagonal roofs have 8 roof planes meeting at a central ridge, or, in the case of a pyramid-style roof, at a single central peak. Caleb chose the pyramid configuration, 8 triangular roof sections converging at a king post at the apex. This shape, he had reasoned, would shed snow radially in all directions rather than loading it on 2 opposing slopes as a gabled roof does. In a valley that routinely received 4 to 6 feet of snow between December and February, roof load was not a theoretical concern. It was the difference between a standing cabin and a collapsed one. The third element, and the one that most irritated the builders who stopped to watch, was the stove placement. Caleb had acquired a heavy cast-iron box stove, approximately 200 pounds, and he intended to position it as close to the geometric center of the cabin as the chimney run would allow. The chimney would rise straight through the peak of the roof, minimizing horizontal flue runs that cause creosote buildup and draft problems. Center heat source. Equal wall distances. 8 walls radiating warmth back toward the middle rather than letting it escape through a single cold exterior face. To a trained carpenter raised on rectangular construction, this looked like chaos. The angular log cuts seemed fussy and unnecessary. The central stove seemed impractical. How do you reach it easily? Where do you put furniture against a wall that's only 8 feet wide? Where do you hang tools and shelves on walls that meet at odd angles? Reuben Aldrich, who had passed the building site 3 times during framing, summarized the collective skepticism one afternoon in November with the precision of a man who knew he was being quoted. He's building a geometry lesson. Come February, it'll be the coldest geometry lesson in the valley. What Aldrich and the others couldn't see, or wouldn't, was the physics underneath the geometry. Thermal radiation follows the inverse square law. Heat intensity drops sharply with distance. A centered stove in an octagonal room kept every wall surface within roughly the same radial distance from the heat source, somewhere between 7 and 9 feet, depending on the diameter. In a comparable square cabin of similar floor area, the corners were nearly 40% farther from a wall-mounted fireplace than the nearest wall surface was. That 40% distance difference translated into an enormous difference in radiant heat delivery. You can feel it with your hand near a campfire. Move it 2 feet farther away, and the warmth drops dramatically. Walls follow the same law. Caleb's walls weren't just receiving heat, they were storing it. At 10 to 12 inches thick, a solid fir wall holds a meaningful amount of thermal energy. Once heated through, it releases that energy slowly back into the room long after the stove has been banked for the night. 8 walls of stored warmth, wrapping a sleeping man from all sides. He finished the framing in late November, just as the first serious cold settled into the valley. By the time Caleb Morrow raised his roof peak in the 3rd week of November 1883, half the valley had an opinion about what he was doing, and most of those opinions were unfavorable. The reaction wasn't malicious exactly. It was the particular cruelty of practical men who have survived hard winters and believe, with complete sincerity, that survival requires doing what has always worked. Square walls, gabled roof, fireplace on the north wall. Proven, tested, done. An octagon was none of those things. The loggers from the Stevensville mill who passed Caleb's site on their morning run began making a game of it. They called his cabin the Beehive. One man, a broad-shouldered Swede who had been felling timber in the valley for 6 years, told his crew that the thing looked like a fort designed by someone who had never been in a fight. The laughter that followed carried across the frozen ground to where Caleb was working, and local accounts describe him pausing, axe in hand, before resuming without comment. The social pressure was more pointed than mere laughter. In a frontier settlement, building choices were communal statements. A man who built differently was implicitly criticizing the men who built conventionally. Several families who had extended Caleb small courtesies during his first 2 years in the valley, offers of shared meals, help with supply runs, grew noticeably cooler. There was a wordless withdrawal of goodwill, the kind that happens in tight communities when someone breaks ranks without explanation. The cruelest moment came from Reuben Aldrich himself. Aldrich had a reputation built over 2 decades, and he understood that his standing depended on being right about buildings. One afternoon in late November, with a small audience of mill hands and neighboring homesteaders gathered around a supply wagon, Aldrich walked a slow circle around Caleb's nearly complete cabin, hands clasped behind his back, studying it with the exaggerated patience of a man performing expertise. He knocked on one of the angled corner joints with his knuckle. He looked up at the pyramid roof peak. He scratched his jaw. Then he turned to the group and said, "The cold will find the angles. It always does. And when it does, there won't be enough wood in the Bitterroot to keep that stove ahead of it." The gathered men nodded. A few laughed. Someone made a remark about geometry being better suited to schoolhouses than to Montana winters. Caleb, who was inside fitting his stovepipe, heard all of it through the walls. He said nothing. He had one more task before the first real storm: banking the exterior base of the cabin with packed earth and dry leaves to a height of about 2 feet, creating a crude but effective insulating skirt around the foundation. It was an old technique used by sod house builders, and before them, by indigenous builders across the northern plains who had understood for centuries that the coldest air in a winter storm runs low along the ground and enters a structure from below. Nobody noticed him doing it, and nobody, at that point, was watching closely enough to care. Stay right here, because what happened next is the part that silenced Reuben Aldrich completely. Like this video if you want to see more history that the textbooks cut out. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. And drop a comment. What's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? The storm that arrived in the second week of December 1883 was not, by Montana standards, unprecedented, but it was severe enough to matter and to measure. It came from the northwest, the way the worst ones always did in the Bitterroot, dropping temperatures that had been hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 9 degrees Celsius down, to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius within a single overnight period. The wind came with it, sustained at somewhere between 20 and 30 miles an hour, with gusts that stripped snow from exposed ridgelines and drove it horizontally across the valley floor. Visibility at the Stevensville trading post, according to records kept by the post proprietor, dropped below 50 yards for most of 2 days. The valley's square cabins responded the way square cabins always responded to that kind of assault. They fought the cold and slowly lost. The fireplace in the Halverson homestead, a well-built cabin about a quarter-mile from Caleb's site, consumed 3 times its usual daily wood load in the first 48 hours of the storm. The Halverson family, father, mother, and 2 young children, kept the fire burning around the clock in shifts, and still recorded ice forming on the interior wall opposite the fireplace. The temperature in that cabin's far corners, later estimated from oral accounts, likely never climbed above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 1 degree Celsius during the storm's worst hours, even with the fire at full blast. Across the valley, the story repeated with variations. Wet wood that had been stored in inadequately sheltered stacks refused to burn cleanly, filling cabins with smoke. Chinking that had dried and cracked in the autumn let in thin knives of -18 degrees Fahrenheit air along every seam. 2 families left their cabins entirely and moved in with better supplied neighbors. One man burned his wooden sled for fuel. At Caleb Morrow's Octagon cabin, the cast-iron stove burned at a moderate, even pace. He did not run out of wood. He did not burn through the night in shifts. He slept. The first person to take notice was Edna Hargrove, a practical-minded woman who lived 200 yards to the east and who came to Caleb's door on the second morning of the storm, ostensibly to ask if he had spare tallow candles. What she actually wanted to know, and said so directly because frontier life had little patience for indirection, was why there was only a thin thread of smoke coming from his chimney when every other cabin in sight was pouring black columns into the sky. Caleb let her in. She stood in the center of the room and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's warm in here. Not warm like a fire that's consuming itself, trying to compensate. Warm like a room that has absorbed heat and is holding it. The difference is perceptible." She pressed her hand against the interior wall surface and found it genuinely warm to the touch. Not just not cold, but warm. The 8 walls of the octagon had been accumulating heat for weeks at this point, and they were giving it back slowly and evenly, the way a stone hearth holds warmth hours after the last coal has gone dark. She went back home, but she told her husband. And her husband told the Halverson boy when he came over to borrow, and adds the following day. And the Halverson boy, red-faced from 2 nights of fire tending, walked over to see for himself. Word moved the way it always moved in isolated winter communities, slowly, person to person, with the specific credibility of direct testimony. By the 4th day of the storm, 4 people had stood in Caleb's Octagon cabin and reported the same observation. Reuben Aldrich was not among them. Not yet. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind dropped first, then the temperature climbed back toward 10 degrees Fahrenheit, -12 degrees Celsius, and the valley slowly exhaled. What followed wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There was no public reckoning, no moment where Reuben Aldrich stood in the town square and recanted. Frontier communities don't work that way. Truth in those places doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives with winter, and it speaks through the things that survive and the things that don't. The reckoning was quieter, and in some ways more devastating for that. The Halverson family had burned through approximately 4.5 cords of wood during the 5-day storm. Their cabin, a well-constructed 16 by 18-foot square structure with a stone fireplace on the north wall, had held an average interior temperature that neighbors and oral accounts estimated at somewhere between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius to 7 degrees Celsius, during the worst 2 nights, barely above freezing, with the fire burning continuously. Comparable accounts from 3 other square cabins in the immediate area told similar stories. 2 to 3 times their normal daily wood consumption, families sleeping in rotation to keep the fire alive, and interior temperatures that hovered at the dangerous margin between cold and dangerous cold. Caleb Morrow's Octagon cabin, over those same 5 days, consumed just under 2 cords. He had not burned through the night. He had not burned in shifts. He had banked the stove at roughly 10 o'clock each evening, reducing the airflow to slow the burn to a long, low simmer, and slept until morning. When Edna Hargrove's husband, a methodical man named Garrett, came by on the 6th day with a thermometer he had borrowed from the trading post, he recorded the interior temperature of the Octagon at 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius, measured at mid-morning with the stove burning at its usual moderate rate. He then walked to the Halverson cabin and recorded 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius under comparable conditions. Fire burning, no drafts. The gap was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Later that same afternoon, with the stove and the Octagon burning more actively, a second reading produced a figure that would be repeated for years afterward in the valley. 21 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 12 degrees Celsius, warmer than the Halverson cabin, at less than half the wood consumption. Those 2 numbers, 21 degrees and half the wood, are what changed everything. Not because people were ready to believe in geometry, But because 2 chords versus 4.5 chords is a number that means something concrete to a man who spends September and October splitting wood with an axe. It means weeks of labor. It means the difference between having enough and running short in a February that doesn't end when you expected it to. On the frontier, efficiency wasn't an engineering preference. It was survival arithmetic. Garrett Hargrove didn't make a speech. He went home, told Edna what the thermometer said, and spent the next 3 evenings sitting with Caleb at the Octagon's central stove, asking questions. How did you calculate the wall angles? How did you seat the bevel cuts? How long did it take for the walls to fully warm through after you first lit the stove? Caleb answered each question with the patience of a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. Reuben Aldrich came in January. He didn't knock immediately. A man who watched from the Trading Post window that morning later said that Aldrich stood outside the Octagon for several minutes, hands in his coat pockets, studying the corner joints and the roof peak with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite admiration, not quite embarrassment, somewhere between the two. Then he knocked. Caleb opened the door. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. "Come in," Caleb said. Aldrich stepped inside, stood near the center of the room, and was quiet for a long time. He put his hand on the wall, the same gesture Edna Hargrove had made 6 weeks earlier. The wall was warm. He looked up at the chimney, rising straight through the roof peak. He looked at the stove, modest and steady at the room's center. He looked at the 8 walls closing evenly around him, no cold corner to escape to, no scorching face to turn away from. The room felt, and this was the word people kept using when they described it, balanced. He didn't apologize. Men like Aldrich rarely did. But he asked Caleb to walk him through the bevel gauge setup, and he stayed for 2 hours. By the spring of 1884, Garrett Hargrove had begun framing an octagonal addition onto his existing cabin. Not a full replacement, but a new sleeping room, 8-sided and centered on a small cast-iron stove. The work attracted attention, and Caleb was consulted. He drew the bevel angles out in charcoal on a plank, explained the log seating technique, and answered questions from 3 other homesteaders who had arrived uninvited but were made welcome. The idea spread the way practical ideas always spread in isolated communities, not through proclamation, but through imitation and adaptation. A trapper north of Stevensville built a full octagonal cabin in the summer of 1884, modifying Caleb's pyramid roof to include a small loft space beneath the peak, an adaptation that added sleeping area without sacrificing the central chimney alignment. A widow near the Bitterroot River built a smaller version, 6 sides instead of 8, which was structurally simpler to frame but retained the key principle. No sharp corners, centered heat source, thick walls as thermal battery. By the winter of 1886, oral accounts and regional records suggest that somewhere between 12 and 16 structures in the greater Stevensville area incorporated some version of the octagonal or multi-sided design principle. None of them were identical to Caleb's original. They were adapted, simplified, localized, the way all genuinely useful ideas eventually become common property, absorbed into the practical knowledge of a place until no one can quite remember where they started. Reuben Aldrich built one too. He never said so publicly, but a cabin attributed to his hand, constructed in the summer of 1885 on a lot east of town, was recorded in a neighbor's correspondence as having 8 walls meeting in the manner of the Morrow cabin and staying warm on a cold diet that would starve any square house in the valley. He had learned. They all had. What Caleb Morrow understood, and what the storm of December 1883 proved in the most unambiguous terms available to frontier people, was not a secret. It was physics. Heat radiates from a point source in all directions simultaneously, and it obeys geometry as surely as it obeys chemistry. Put your heat source at the center of an enclosed space. Minimize the sharp angles where cold air pools. Build your walls thick enough to absorb warmth during the burning hours and release it during the sleeping hours. Bank your fire at night instead of feeding it in panic. Let the structure itself do part of the work. These are not modern insights. They are ancient ones, rediscovered and applied by a quiet man with a broad axe and a bevel gauge in a frozen Montana valley. The Blackfoot and Salish peoples of the region had understood radial heat geometry for centuries in their lodge construction. Circular or near-circular forms, central fire, walls angled to reflect warmth inward. Caleb had not studied their designs directly, but he had arrived, through cold observation and personal necessity, at the same fundamental conclusion. The circle, or its closest practical approximation in log construction, is warmer than the square. The experts laughed. The winter measured, and 21 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't argue back. The lesson here isn't that modern building science is wrong. It's that it is incomplete without the lived knowledge of people who built where the margin for error was narrow and the consequences of failure were not a drafty room, but a frozen family. Vernacular architecture, the architecture of necessity, of available materials, of hard-won seasonal knowledge, solved problems that formal training hadn't yet framed as questions. Caleb Morrow wasn't a genius. He was a man who paid attention to cold. And in paying attention, he built something that worked when everything built by convention was struggling to survive. That's not a frontier story. That's an engineering story. It just happens to be set in Montana in 1883. If this changed how you think about heat and building design, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about this kind of history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest night you've ever spent in a structure that wasn't keeping you as warm as it should have? We read every single one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.